You never get used to the smell. People think a mental hospital smells like bleach and antiseptic, but that's not true. The air is heavy, damp, and carries a metallic tang, like old blood. For me, it always lingered the most in the East Wing of Hollow Pines Psychiatric Facility. That's where the long-term patients stayed, the ones who had nowhere else to go. I started working there a year ago, desperate for steady work after moving to the quiet town of Blackridge Hollow. It wasn't my dream job, but I figured being a night orderly would be easy enough, mostly paperwork, maybe the occasional escort to the med room. It didn't take long for me to realize how wrong I was. On my second week, I was assigned to the East Wing. The other staff avoided it whenever they could. The patients there had stories, whispered about in the break room when they thought no one was listening. But one name came up more than the others: Henry Greaves, the patient in room 12. They should have locked him up somewhere else, a nurse muttered one night. Not here. Not with us. When I asked what made Henry so dangerous, she just shook her head. Let's just say he's the reason we installed extra locks on the doors. I wasn't supposed to interact with Henry directly. He was on a strict no-contact order. But working the night shift in the East Wing meant I couldn't avoid him entirely. His room was at the end of the hallway, the door reinforced with thick steel and an observation window. The first time I saw him, I couldn't stop staring. Henry was sitting on the floor, his back to the wall. His wrists were bound to a restraint belt, his head tilted to one side. He was humming softly to himself, a low, monotonous tune that sent chills down my spine. Is he sedated? I asked the charge nurse, a woman named Maggie who'd worked there for over a decade. She glanced at the room and nodded. Always. You don't want to see him when he's not. That night, during my rounds, I passed Henry's room again. The humming had stopped, replaced by something worse. Whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like he was talking to someone. Low, urgent, almost pleading. I leaned closer to the door, trying to listen. Are you lost? The voice snapped me upright. I turned to see Maggie standing behind me, her arms crossed. Don't linger near his door, she said, her tone sharp. He has a way of getting into people's heads. I wanted to laugh it off, but the look on her face stopped me. There was fear in her eyes. That was my first week in the East Wing. By the second week, I realized the whispers weren't just in Henry's room. I started hearing them in the hallway. At first, I thought it was the other patients. Some of them talked in their sleep or muttered nonsense at all hours. But the whispers were different. They followed me, growing louder the closer I got to room 12. One night, after finishing my rounds, I sat at the nurse's station, going through patient files. When I got to Henry's file, I hesitated. The folder was thicker than the others, the edges worn from years of handling. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Henry Greaves had been institutionalized for over 20 years. He was admitted after being found in the woods outside a nearby town, covered in blood. It wasn't his. The file listed the names of 3 people: Eleanor Price, 32, Mark Price, 34, Rebecca Price, 7. Their bodies were discovered in their home, each one displaying signs of extensive mutilation. The official report claimed Henry confessed to the murders, though the details didn't add up. The file also included a note from the original attending psychiatrist. Patient exhibits extreme dissociation and claims he was following instructions. Says he is just a vessel. Recommends indefinite confinement. I closed the file, my hands shaking. That's when I heard it again. The humming. It was coming from behind me. I turned, expecting to see another orderly or a nurse. But the hallway was empty. The humming grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right next to my ear. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. For the rest of the night, I stayed at the nurse's station, too afraid to move. When my shift ended, I practically ran out of the building, the whispers still echoing in my ears. The next night, I made a decision. I needed to see Henry up close. During my rounds, I stopped outside his door, my heart pounding. He was sitting in the same position as before, his head tilted, his eyes half closed. But this time he wasn't humming. He was smiling. I leaned closer to the observation window, trying to get a better look. That's when his eyes snapped open. He looked directly at me, his smile widening. And then he spoke. "You're next," he whispered. The words were muffled by the glass, but I heard them clearly. They weren't a threat. They were a promise. The East Wing always felt wrong at night. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive. Like the building was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That night, something did. It started during my second round. I was walking the long corridor, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights above me the only sound. When I passed room 12, I noticed something out of place. The door was slightly ajar. I stopped cold, my pulse pounding in my ears. Henry's door was supposed to be locked at all times. No exceptions. "Henry!" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer. I pushed the door open slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The room was empty. The restraints on the bed were undone, the thick leather straps hanging limply over the sides. The air smelled faintly metallic, like blood. I stepped inside, my flashlight sweeping the room. The corners were empty, the shadows thick and oppressive. But when I turned toward the bed, I froze. On the mattress, smeared in dark streaks, was the word, "Help." It wasn't written neatly. It was scratched into the fabric, the edges fraying where the material had been torn. I backed away, my stomach twisting. Before I could leave, I heard something. A faint sound, almost like breathing, coming from the far corner of the room. I swung the flashlight around, the beam landing on a small vent near the floor. The grate was loose, hanging by a single screw. Behind it was darkness. The sound grew louder, wet, uneven breaths that sent chills down my spine. I crouched down, peering into the vent. The air was cold, the smell stronger now, like iron and damp earth. "Henry!" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The breathing stopped. I scrambled out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My hand shook as I fumbled with the lock, securing it before stepping back. It wasn't until I reached the nurse's station that I realized my pant leg was damp. I looked down and saw a dark stain creeping up the fabric. Blood. Maggie was at the desk, her face pale as she stared at me. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tight. I told her about the door, the bed, the vent. "Someone needs to check the system," I said. "There's a crawl space behind the walls. If he's in there." Maggie cut me off, shaking her head. "He can't be. Henry doesn't leave that room." But he had. I'd seen it with my own eyes. Maggie called maintenance, and within an hour, 2 men arrived to inspect the vent. I stayed behind the nurse's station, watching as they unscrewed the grate and shone a flashlight inside. "What the hell is that?" one of them muttered, pulling back with a grimace. The other leaned closer, squinting into the darkness. "Looks like hair." They pulled out a clump of something tangled and damp. At first, I thought it was just debris, but as they laid it on the floor, the truth became clear. It was a scalp. The room felt like it was closing in, the air thick and suffocating. I turned away, bile rising in my throat as the maintenance men exchanged nervous glances. "Call the police," Maggie whispered. The officers arrived quickly, their heavy boots echoing through the hallway as they made their way to room 12. I stayed behind, listening as they questioned Maggie and inspected the vent. When they finally emerged, their faces were grim. "We'll need to talk to Mr. Greaves," one of them said, his tone clipped. Maggie hesitated. He's not in his room," she admitted. The officer frowned. "Then where is he?" None of us had an answer. The rest of the night was chaos. The police combed through the facility, their radios crackling with updates as they searched every room and hallway. But Henry was gone. By morning, the officers had found nothing. No sign of Henry, no sign of where the scalp had come from. "Keep the doors locked," one of them said as they left, his expression grim. "And if he comes back, call us immediately." I didn't sleep that day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the blood on my pants, the scratches on the bed, the scalp lying on the floor. The next night I was back on shift, My nerves shot. The East Wing was quieter than usual, the patients subdued as if they knew something was wrong. Around midnight, the lights flickered. It was brief, just a momentary pulse of darkness, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. When the lights came back on, I noticed something strange. The door to room 12 was open again. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling as I approached the door. The room was empty, just as it had been the night before. But something was different. The bed was gone. In its place was a single chair, positioned in the center of the room. Sitting on the chair was a pile of clothes, tattered and blood-stained, the fabric barely holding together. They weren't just clothes. They were Henry's. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. Henry hadn't just escaped. He'd left a message, and I wasn't sure I'd survive long enough to understand it. I stared at the pile of clothes for what felt like an eternity. The fabric was stiff with dried blood, the stains dark and jagged like someone had ripped it apart. But it wasn't just the clothes that unsettled me. It was the silence. The room felt too quiet, too still. It was the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I backed out slowly, my flashlight flickering as if it was struggling to stay on. Maggie found me at the nurse's station, her face pale. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. I told her about the clothes, my words spilling out in a frantic whisper. Her expression hardened. "We need to call the police again," she said. But deep down I knew it wouldn't matter. They wouldn't find him. That night, the East Wing felt different. The air was colder, the lights dimmer. The patients were restless, their voices echoing softly through the halls. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows darting just out of view. But the worst part was the smell. It started around midnight, faint at first but growing stronger as the hours dragged on. It was the sharp, acrid stench of decay. At first, I thought it was coming from room 12. But as I approached, I realized it was everywhere. The walls, the floors, the air itself seemed saturated with it. I reached the door to room 12, my hand trembling as I turned the handle. The chair and the clothes were still there, untouched. But now there was something else. On the far wall, smeared in what looked like blood, were 3 words. "I am here." I stumbled back, my stomach twisting as the smell grew stronger. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. When I reached the nurse's station, Maggie was already on the phone with the police. "They're sending a team," she said, her voice tight. But the look in her eyes told me she didn't believe it would help. Neither did I. The officers arrived within the hour, their heavy boots thudding against the tile floors. They swept through the East Wing, their flashlights cutting through the dim light. When they reached room 12, one of them stopped cold. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, shining his light on the wall. The blood smears were gone. The chair and clothes were still there, but the words had disappeared, leaving only the faintest stains behind. "This has to be some kind of prank," another officer said, shaking his head. But his voice was shaky, and his hand hovered near his holster. By the time they left, the officers were more unnerved than they let on. "Keep the doors locked," one of them said, his eyes darting toward the shadows. "And call us if anything else happens." That night, the scratching started. It was faint at first, like the sound of fingernails dragging against wood. I thought it was coming from room 12, but as I moved through the hallway, I realized it was all around me. The walls themselves seemed alive, the sound echoing from every direction. I stopped outside room 14, my breath catching in my throat. The door was open, the room dark and empty. But as I stepped inside, the smell hit me like a physical force. Rot. I covered my nose, my flashlight trembling as I swept the room. The bed was overturned, the mattress slashed open. And in the corner, just barely visible in the dim light, was a hole in the wall. It wasn't large, just big enough for someone to crawl through. The edges were jagged, the plaster crumbling as if it had been torn apart by hand. I crouched down, shining the flashlight into the opening. The space beyond was dark, the air cold and damp, but I could see faint streaks on the floor, drag marks leading deeper into the crawlspace. Jake, don't. Maggie's voice came from behind me, startling me. I turned to see her standing in the doorway, her face pale. There's nothing good in there, she said, her voice trembling. But I couldn't walk away. I climbed into the hole, the walls pressing against my shoulders as I crawled through the narrow space. The air was thick and suffocating, the stench of decay growing stronger with every inch. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the other side. The space opened up into a small, hidden room, the walls covered in dark stains. In the center of the room was a makeshift bed, a pile of rags and blankets soaked with something wet and foul. And lying on the bed was a body. It was skeletal, the flesh stripped away in patches, the eye sockets empty. But the worst part was the position. The body's hands were bound, its legs tied together, as if it had been left there to rot. I stumbled back, gagging as I scrambled out of the crawl space. When I emerged, Maggie was still there, her face pale and her hands shaking. "What did you see?" she asked. I couldn't answer. I didn't have the words. The body wasn't just a victim. It was a warning, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. The body in the crawlspace had shaken me to my core. But what terrified me more was how quickly it had vanished. The police didn't believe me. Even Maggie, who had seen the bloodied clothes and the state of room 14, seemed to be in denial. "They're covering it up," she said quietly when we were alone. "This place, things like this don't happen without someone trying to bury it." We worked the next shift in silence. The air in the East Wing was heavy, the kind that clung to your skin and made it hard to breathe. The lights flickered more than usual, but no one dared to call maintenance. Not after what they'd found. Around midnight, Maggie nudged me. "Someone's in the hallway," she said, her voice low. I looked at the monitor. The grainy feed from the East Wing camera showed a figure moving slowly near room 12. It wasn't a patient. The figure was wearing a hoodie, their face obscured. They moved deliberately, stopping at each door as if looking for something or someone. "Call security," I whispered, grabbing the flashlight from the desk. "What are you doing?" Maggie hissed, grabbing my arm. "Wait for backup." But I couldn't. If this person was responsible for the body or worse, then I needed to know. I stepped into the hallway, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The air smelled faintly of damp plaster and something metallic. The figure was still moving, their steps slow and deliberate. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing down the corridor. The figure stopped, their back to me. For a moment they didn't move. Then, without turning, they ducked into room 12. I broke into a run, my pulse pounding in my ears as I reached the door. It was slightly ajar, just like the night before. Inside, the room was dark, the faint glow of the hallway light spilling onto the floor. "Come out where I can see you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no response. I stepped inside, shining the flashlight around the room. The bed was overturned, the chair missing. The walls were scratched, deep gouges running vertically like claw marks. But the room was empty. I turned back toward the door, my breath catching as I noticed something on the floor. A set of footprints, smudged and uneven, leading toward the corner of the room. The vent. It was the same one I'd seen before, the grate hanging loosely on one side. I crouched down, my flashlight trembling as I shone it inside. The crawlspace was dark, the air cold and damp. I could see faint streaks on the floor, drag marks, disappearing into the shadows. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. Then I heard it, breathing. It was faint but deliberate, a slow, wet rasp that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The breathing stopped. I ran out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. Maggie was waiting for me at the nurse's station, her face pale. "What happened?" she asked. "There's someone in the crawlspace," I said, my voice shaking. "We called security, but by the time they arrived, the room was empty again. The vent was sealed, the scratches on the walls gone. It was as if nothing had ever happened." The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. The next day, I decided I couldn't keep quiet any longer. I went to the administrator's office, demanding answers. I told him about the body, the tracks, the vent, and the person I'd seen in the hallway. He listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "This facility has been here for over 60 years, he said slowly. "And in that time we've had our share of incidents." I frowned. "What kind of incidents?" "Disappearances," he said, his voice dropping. "Staff, patients. Sometimes things happen in a place like this that can't be explained." I stared at him, my chest tightening. "Why hasn't this been investigated?" He shook his head, his eyes avoiding mine. "Because no one wants to know the answers." I left his office feeling more uneasy than ever. That night, I returned to the East Wing, determined to stay alert. The hallway was quiet, the lights casting long shadows across the floor. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps. I turned, expecting to see Maggie or another staff member. But the hallway was empty. The footsteps continued, growing louder, coming from the direction of room 12. I gripped the flashlight tightly, moving toward the door. It was ajar again, the dim light spilling onto the floor. Inside, the room was dark, the smell of damp plaster stronger than before. I stepped inside, shining the flashlight around the space. The walls were covered in scratches again, deeper this time, as if someone had been clawing at them. But the bed and chair were gone. In their place, in the center of the room, was a pile of clothes, blood-stained. And this time they weren't Henry's. I recognized them. They belonged to Maggie. Maggie's clothes were unmistakable. The blue scrubs, the name tag still pinned to the fabric, streaked with dried blood. I stared at the pile, my mind reeling. Maggie had been at the nurse's station just an hour ago. I bolted from the room, running down the hall toward the station. The desk was empty. The chair she'd been sitting in was tipped over, her clipboard lying on the floor. "Maggie!" I called out, my voice echoing down the corridor. Silence. I grabbed the radio from the desk and called for security. "There's an emergency in the East Wing," I said, my voice shaking. "Send someone now." The response crackled through the static. "We're on our way. Stay where you are." But I couldn't stay. I couldn't just stand there, knowing Maggie was gone. I retraced my steps, checking every room, every corner of the wing. The air grew colder the farther I went, the faint smell of blood lingering in the air. When I reached room 14, I froze. The door was open, the faint light from the hallway spilling inside. I stepped closer, my breath catching as I saw what was on the floor. Footprints. Large, uneven prints, smeared with blood, leading from the door to the crawlspace. The vent was open again, the grate hanging by a single screw. I crouched down, shining my flashlight into the darkness. "Maggie!" I called out, my voice trembling. The only response was the faint sound of something moving, deeper in the crawlspace. I climbed inside, the walls pressing against my shoulders as I crawled forward. The air was damp, the smell of decay growing stronger with every inch. The passage twisted and turned, the floor slick with something I didn't want to identify. When I reached the end, I stopped. The space opened into a hidden room, the walls lined with jagged cracks. In the center of the room was Maggie. She was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, her head slumped forward. Her arms were tied to her sides with thick rope, her scrubs soaked with blood. "Maggie!" I rushed to her, my hands shaking as I untied the ropes. Her head lolled to the side, her eyes fluttering open. "Jake!" she whispered, her voice weak. "He's here." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Who's here?" Before she could answer, I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. I turned, my flashlight shaking as the beam cut through the darkness. Henry. He stood in the doorway, his thin frame blocking the exit. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, but his expression was calm, almost serene. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice soft but steady. "This isn't for you." I stepped in front of Maggie, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. "Let us go," I said, my voice trembling. Henry tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "It's not about you," he said. "It's about the others." Before I could respond, he stepped back into the crawl space, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't wait to see where he went. I pulled Maggie to her feet, half carrying her as we crawled back through the narrow passage. The walls seemed to close in around us, the air thick with the stench of blood and rot. When we finally emerged into the hallway, the security team was waiting. Their radios crackled as they scanned the area, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. But Henry was gone. Maggie was taken to the hospital, her injuries severe but not life-threatening. She told the police everything, the body in the crawl space, the pile of clothes, the hidden room. But when they searched the east wing, they found nothing. The crawl space was sealed. The scratches on the walls were gone. And room 12 was empty. Henry Greaves had vanished. Do you think Henry was acting alone? Or was something else going on in that hospital?